our talk is probably about 40 minutes long, and but we really want to have time to kind of get your feedback because you guys spend a lot of time on the river. And as you'll find, from my perspective, the Madison's a bit of a tough nut to crack with all of the different things going on between Hebgen and Madison Dam and Quake Lake and these issues that we're talking about. So what we're doing here is about a year and a few months ago, Northwest Energy and FWP, they have a technical advisory group, and they were looking at the monitoring that have been going on with regard to the flushing flows that is part of the FERC licensing, which is whenever they can, and we'll talk about this a little bit today, to release a flush out of Hebgen with the intention of flushing fine sediment from the river. But they've been monitoring this company called R2, and they're like, we're just not seeing an effect. We're really not seeing a change in the fine sediment in response to these flushing flows. So FWP was interested to know, well, okay, so what are these flows doing? And are we getting enough flushing flows to kind of shake up the river, to get spawning gravels moved and mobilized and stored? And could we raise those flushing flows and start excavating, as you know, the Madison's kind of a bimodal river with sediment, big stuff in the middle, then a lot of gravels moving through. So a lot of that larger material, would it be possible to get some dynamics going? Because the Madison is what you would call an underfit stream. It was built during, glacial times, and it's winnowed and created all these terraces. So there's a lot of material that doesn't move very much. So what we are just trying to get a sense of, how do flows relate to turnover in the river, and how can we, and would it be valuable to increase the level of disturbance related to those flows, or not? Should they be used for something else? Or just, are they providing other values, like with respect to riparian regeneration and things that we'll touch on? So so last spring we started, and it was great. We were working really closely with Travis Lorenz from FWP here, and his colleague Jenna. And this is all of us out on the Varney Reach, and they were tremendous, collecting sediment data. So my job was, and Remy was involved, we'd go out in the field and collect all this data. I kind of did the geomorph components, looking at turnover, where it's coming from, where do we see spawning gravels. And Remy did the incipient mobility, which is the sediment mobility calculations relating them to flow at the reaches that we looked at. So those were the main objectives, was to look at sediment mobility to see if something could be done with these flushing flows. And this was really geared towards spawning habitat, which you can see we touch on fines because that's been studied a lot, but a lot of this was actually the gravel component. So we went out and we collected pebble counts from 4 reaches where FWP does their sampling, Pine Butte, Varney, Norris, and Great Cliff. We also wanted to look at boulders and wood to see if they were promoting scour in the bed of the channel, local scour, to see if maybe that would be generating spawning gravels from those pockets. And it was also discussed in terms of the potential restoration measure. Would it be great? Because that's becoming popular, to add scour elements to streams for habitat. Then we looked at floodplain turnover, we mapped it, and then went out in the field and verified it. Remy came in, they did a topographic survey, they did a bathymetric survey of the whole river, and developed a hydraulic model of each reach, performed the sediment mobility analysis, and then we talked about opportunities, how it may relate to spawning gravels. So these are the 4 reaches that we looked at. You're probably all familiar with them. So you could tell we were just working on fairly small sections of river, but they're really different, as you know. So the next slide, this zooms in on the upper part, Pine Butte, which is right above the West Fork of the Madison confluence. And that you can see on the right, it's pretty confined. It's got some islands, but largely a confined single thread channel with not a lot of turnover. And then Varney, of course, really complex. It's up against that low terrace. This is looking upstream. You can see on the left, on the east side, and which is contributing material, but really different channel type between Pine Butte and Varney. And then we came down below Ennis Lake and looked at Norris. And here at Norris, this is where, when you drive up the highway and you see all these islands, this has and Remy will be talking about this, a really high density of reds, of spawning both browns and rainbow on that low energy surface at Norris. So it's got some complexity, but pretty much the main channel is a gun barrel. And then of course down at Great Cliff, we start hitting the lower Madison Valley and spreading out. So the reason I bring these up is because it turns out the results of this, the morphology of the river really matters in terms of spawning gravels, which is not surprising. So the results, we'll be talking about the sediment, what we learned, a little bit on the local scour measurements, where we saw turnover and how much. And then we did an inventory of looking at sources of sediment, since we know we have an issue with a big sediment trap at Hebgen Lake, and then looked at mobility of those types of sediments. So this is collecting data up at Pine Butte, and this is going out into the channel, and we based a pebble count is an established way. We have these measuring devices. Each of these guys have one. You can kind of see someone's holding one right there. Is that you, Remy? It's just a metal plate with a bunch of squares, and it's sized to fit a geotechnical grid, like if you did a sieve analysis. So you basically measure the size of the rocks, and they're yelling it out, and someone's writing down, and you measure 100 counts. And this count right here is the big material. And then we go find stuff that had evidence that it was actually moving, gravel bars, shadow bars, things like that, and we measured that stuff. So first thing we had to figure out is what is a spawning gravel, and it can depend on a lot of things. It can depend on the size of the fish, the velocity of the water, whatever. A fish can dig a red in and maintain good oxygen. But in general, we chose, this is a paper by a guy named Matt Condolf out of Berkeley, and they looked at a whole bunch of different fish and looked at the range of materials that they were successfully spawning in. So we took, for rainbows and browns are in the pink circle, and we chose 10 to 35 millimeters to which is about half to an inch and a half, to reflect that good core spawning gravel range for those trout. And that was just basically to see, are we even looking at a good suite? Are they rare? Are they common? So this is the results of those pebble counts. So each plot is each of those 4 sites that we looked at, and each set of bars, each one of these is so that's pebble count 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's at Great Cliff. And then each of them has 3 bars. And the bars are the gradations. The blues are the median. I mean, the orange, sorry, is the median. It's what we call the D50. So 50% of the class that we collected were coarser, 50% were smaller. The green is the D84, which is the coarser fraction, and then the D16 is the fine stuff. And we can look at sorting. We can look at, the difference between those numbers. But you'll see that Remy ran these numbers to look at, are we moving the coarse stuff, the fine stuff, the moderate stuff, under the current flow regime. So those little light blue bands that go across each one, that's that spawning gravel fraction. So you can see when we were out in the coarse bed material, the numbers are really different. This active layer that are bars, point bars, riffles where we could find them, much smaller. And then of course it gets really bony out in the middle of the river, which I think you guys are all fully aware of. And also in this active layer, we're getting a really good signature of spawning gravels. The D50 is almost always within it, which means, we just have a wide range of the gravels out there that are good for spawning. And then not so great when we're out here in the bed of the channel. And this is what we wanted, because we wanted to see what's the mobility of this active layer that we're talking about here, the spawning gravel mobile stuff, and what's the mobility of this stuff. And can we get this stuff moving with a flushing flow? And how much is this moving with a flushing flow? And is it good? So this is just a plot that shows upstream to downstream. You can see upstream on the right is Pine Butte, and that's just pulling the average D84, the coarser end of a sample, the median in orange, and the smaller stuff. And you can see again, typically D16, D50, yeah, man, we had a really good, so that's good news, right? We had a good, strong spawning gravel signature in all of these pebble counts that we took. These 3, that's the D16, D50, and D84 of the West Fork. And it kind of comes into play here because it is producing really good spawning gravels. And certainly at times, lots of them. So that'll come back in our source assessment, but we did also look at the West Fork. In contrast, this is the bigger stuff out in the middle of the channel, and you can see that it's just a lot larger consistently. Norris is a little bit unusual that we'll talk about, in that it's finer, and it's got it has more fine sediment that they've known for a long time in those spawning beds at Norris. We also have, and I put this in because Remy's going to talk about the McNeil core data. So the pebble counts, we're just picking stuff up off the surface of the channel. McNeil cores are cores that they've been taking for a long time that are 8 inches deep. So they're the stuff that's being accessed when you start moving the material on the top of the bed. And so this compares the D50, in the McNeil cores, to the D50 on the surface, and that's the D84 of the underground stuff, the cores, and the D84 on the surface. And really it shows what you'd expect. But there's in some of these places, there's some pretty big material in those 8-inch deep cores. But the other thing you see is right here, I just wanted to point out at Norris, that stuff that's in those cores 8 inches deep is really pretty fine grained. And they were seeing no evidence that the flow regime was flushing the material out of there. We'll talk about that a little bit later, why that might be. Okay, so then we went out and measured these boulders, and the only two reaches that had a bunch of boulders were Norris and Pine Butte, and we were trying to get 20 in each of them. And we basically went out, we measured the size of the boulder, and we measured the depth and size of the scour pockets it was creating on either side. And you know, it's pretty clear. You guys, I'm sure a lot of you guys fish, and you know that boulders provide great hydraulic diversity. We were trying to see if they were real drivers of scour and sediment mobility. And what we found is that, you know, the plot on top shows the depth of scour, and you can see that horizontal line is 1 foot. So these are all the plots in a box and whisker. And you can, this is upstream of the boulder, downstream, and adjacent to it on the side. And yeah, we're getting some scour, but we're talking about a foot. We're not talking about a 4-foot hole, at least at the flows that we were there, that were driving scour and accessing more sediment. The distances got kind of big, even though they weren't very deep. You know, some of them at Norris, when you're up on that, this is in the main channel, you might get a long scour pocket that could be 15 feet long. So not a lot, really not a lot here. We didn't really see this as an incredible contributor to accessing spawning gravels from the bed of the river. But that said, clearly they provide hydraulic variability and otherwise kind of a trapezoid that's fairly monotonous. I actually heard from some guys up in River Design Group in Whitefish, and they're building a big data set for their restoration planning, and they want this stuff because they're trying to get more of this information to figure out how we might be using boulders and wood more effectively to create habitat and disturb stream beds. So a couple of things that were kind of interesting. This is not a good correlation at all, but in general, the bigger the boulder was, taller this way, we tended to see less scour downstream. And what you could tell is that's because they weren't overtopping the big ones. The ones that overtop were really getting a good scour pocket on the bottom end and creating a little bit different habitat than the ones that don't overtop. And they, of course, get a lot of scour around the sides of them. And so, you know, I think our takeaway was really that boulders are great. They add complexity. They really vary. There were boulders that were overtopping last week that weren't when we were there. It'd be fun to keep looking at it, but there didn't appear to be any tremendous addition in terms of the relationship to spawning gravels. The one thing we did see was down at Norris, where you had these low energy areas, they could actually trap them down below them. So this is where the fish are spawning down at Norris, and you just see these beautiful plumes of spawning gravels on the downstream side. And this is a low energy bench, you know, up closer to the bank down at Norris, a little bit different situation. So stuff that's coming down, it's trapping. So looking at flows and the rates of channel change, you know, we have Hebgen built in the early part of the 20th century, and we have a proposed maximum release of 3,500 CFS from Hebgen. And the reason for that is Quake Lake. When the landslide formed, they were really, really concerned about the outlet getting shredded. And they went, and the Corps dropped the outlet, Corps of Engineers, and reinforced it. And they said, we don't want to see 3,500 CFS going over this whole landslide, because if we start losing its stability, we're going to erode through it and have a lot of problems. And Remy noticed this. This is a great picture I found. It's from the USGS, but you can see they hadn't even rebuilt the highway yet. This must have been, I don't know, in the early 60s, I guess. But what's also relevant here is you can see the big plume of sediment going down towards the slide in, right? Which is really important in terms of spawning gravel sources to the Madison. So to that end, we're looking at, okay, turnover, it's erosion and deposition. How much, where are we seeing it? How much are we seeing it? And does it relate to flows? So these pictures are from up at Pine Butte, and it's really pretty interesting because you guys have probably seen them. You see them north too, because there's all these old kind of relic islands that you have juniper growing on them, and there's cottonwood stumps, and they were there in the imagery pre-Quake Lake, pre-Hebgen earthquake. And then we see a lot of expansion of lower bars, sometimes growing off of those bars, but there's definitely material being deposited and vegetation's coming in. And we did see net expansion of islands in most reaches, except for Norris, where they're kind of trimming out. And it kind of, you know, it really relates. This is from the channel migration zone mapping we did a while ago, where we were measuring rates of change all up and down the Madison. This is the Varney Reach, where we have all this dynamics, you know, hundreds of feet of channel movement since the 50s, just a lot of turnover. And with that, you get a lot of riparian suggestion. There's huge succession, huge crops of cottonwoods growing on these that look like maybe 2011. This spot right here was amazing because it is cold, upwelling water. You know, there's just a lot of really great things going on in this reach where it's inherently dynamic. And then in contrast, you know, you get down Bear Trap and below Bear Trap and it's bedrock and it's just much less dynamic. And the turnover shows that. So on the left is Varney, and the the red is erosion and the yellow is deposition since 95. And 95 to 2019. And this is Norris. So you can see very little. We were basically intersecting mapped channel locations to see where we lost channel, where we gained channel. So if you look at it spatially, it's really concentrated on the Madison. This is going from upstream on the left at the slide down to the lower Madison Valley, Three Forks on the right. And so it's like you see no turnover on the Madison, or you see a lot. And the big spike up on the left is up at the slide where there was a bunch of erosion during the high water of 97. And then you see another spike here at Varney. This is down at Channels, approaching Ennis Lake. And then, you know, virtually nothing through Norris. And then you get to Gray Cliff and it takes off. And you can see in general the lines on the positive are deposition, and the dashed lines are the same time series, but they're erosion. So here that black is deposition at Channels, and that's erosion. And almost everywhere we saw more deposition than erosion. And it doesn't mean volume of sediment, because a lot of these bars are really low. It's just mapped area. But that's good. I mean, we're not stripping out all of the sediment that's in there, which can happen below dams. So then looking at the flows, how does this relate to flows? This is just a plot that shows 1990 to 2022. And it's a cumulative number of days that a given flow was exceeded. So the green line is 4,000, that's the biggest flow. So it has the least number of days exceeded. And you can see they were all by 1997. And then we haven't seen 4,000. This is at Kirby. We haven't seen 4,000 since then. And then these lower flows, you can see that we've progressively had a few days. And I put in last week, up until last week, and you can see we got a little bump. But you know, so we're frequently seeing 2,500. Here's the 3,000, and this gray one, that's the flushing flow, the 3,500. So it's like, okay, we know that 94 to 97, we had a lot of high water in that time. And really what it correlates is to a lot of turnover. We were trying to see if there was like on the Yellowstone right now, we're seeing a threshold where it was past, where the river kind of stabilizes itself with boulders at the toe. It sort of self-armors. It can self-riprap itself if you have boulders accumulating. And a couple weeks ago on the Yellowstone, it looks like those were mobilized and you just got lots of movement. On the Madison, we're not seeing that. We're seeing you have long duration of pretty high flows. So what this is the dots are the flows by year, number of days in any given year above 3,000. Then the bars are the amount of turnover we saw in the imagery when we had the air photos. So we had some from 2005, 2009. And in general, the Madison's pretty mobile. Madison's pretty dynamic. You have more flows, higher duration of those flows, you just get more turnover. And this ties into what Remy's going to talk about with mobility. But one of the big things is duration. This is the hydrograph from 96 and 97, and you can see it got above 4,500 for a few days, but it was above the flushing flow for probably a month. In contrast, a typical flushing flow year, here's 2018, you just kind of sneak above it, and it's just not up very long. So in a mobile system like this, at least not with the big bed material, but those active layers, it's mobile a lot of the time. And so the duration really matters. Okay, then we looked at sediment sources. This is the slide, and clearly it's been a major source of sediment since the slide happened. And the big question is how much will that persist, and will the Madison become sediment starved with spawning gravels? The picture on the lower right is $3 Bridge, and it was kind of impressive to see how much was still there that hadn't stripped out. But this is right after the earthquake. This is 1962 up in Upper River. This is where the slide in is, where you can see that big dike was built. And you can see tons of gravel in the river right after the earthquake, a few years after. And some work has been done where they said at Kirby, 114,000 tons of suspended sediment went through just during the month of September in 1960, just after the earthquake. But this is a comparison at slide in, which is right there. This is before the earthquake in 1959. This is 1962 right after. You can see it just got hammered by sediment. And this is currently. And one thing that's interesting is right after the earthquake, if anybody's familiar with that, you see the main channel running on the south. Well, that's this perch side channel now. That was actually the main thread right after the earthquake, but the rivers migrated back north, against the highway. But that's a remnant primary channel of the Madison. But you can also see it's kind of locking in. It's these are starting to vegetate. These surfaces are really perched. They're high above the river. So are they going to remain? Are they going to be accessible? So looking at how much is the channel banging around up there and accessing those gravels, the picture on the top shows pink. The pink and the green is 1955 to 2009. And that's where I said we had those long duration high flows, and those gravels were getting worked. You can see how much the river moved around up there just by those bank lines. So everything that is green in there got eroded out after 1995. So it was accessing all that material. The one on the bottom is since 2009, and we're just not seeing movement. And maybe up there, we just need a bigger flow, but the slide is evolving and becoming less of a sediment source, as you would expect. It's vegetating in, it's down cut, so those surfaces are higher, and so we see less recruitment of gravels from the Upper Madison, and of course, Hebgen is a total trap. So relying on the Upper Madison long-term as a sediment source might start to get sketchy, and we've talked about all kinds of ways to keep an eye on that. It doesn't seem starved yet, but you would anticipate that the load would go down. But then we looked at a bunch of tributaries, and it was actually pretty optimistic in the Upper Madison. The West Fork is on the left, really good gravels. Squaw Creek, the culvert under the highway, is half full with all kinds of different materials. These are other tributaries. The Ruby brings in a lot of really great gravels. So these were taken in October, and one of the other discussions is, okay, we have gravels, but do we have flow? And so flow is being discussed as both a way to contribute more spawning gravels to the Madison, but also a way to just allow fish access to the habitat that's here. So that's another topic. But I know maybe some of you saw, I guess Indian Creek was just going off last week, really high. It was great. So they probably rely on pulses. Madison Dam, another sediment trap right in the middle of the system, totally sediment starved in Bear Trap Canyon. And so this becomes another big issue with the longevity of spawning gravel sources down below. We do have Bear Trap Creek. If you've ever hiked up there, it's like the one tributary. It's like 3 miles walk in from below the Warm Springs fishing access on the other side of the river, the trailhead. But it's pretty neat, you know, all of a sudden you start to see a lot more complex habitat, potentially spawning areas, but most of the canyon is just steep and fast. This is something we've talked about a bit. This is Hot Springs Creek, and it comes in right at, it goes by Norris Hot Springs, and then comes down and enters the Madison right at the Warm Springs fishing access just upstream, and it is full of mud. And some of this stuff was behind beaver dams, so maybe it's just trapping mud, but if you go downstream on the Madison, there's a couple of islands down there where they do have some spawning below the Warm Springs fishing access, but there's a lot of mud draped down there, and it's really hard to think it's not, some of this is coming out of Hot Springs Creek. Then you look around that picture on the bottom and you see a lot of burnt hillsides and you start wondering. This is a map of fires in the Madison Watershed since I think 1980. I think it starts in the mid 80s maybe. And the photo on the left is the whole watershed, the map, and you can see there really haven't been that many fires, but down in the Norris Reach, you can see quite a cluster, and I blew up the Norris Reach on the right. And Hot Springs Creek, you can see it coming in, and there's just been a bunch of fires, including the big Bear Trap fire of 2012, and then a few fires upstream in the canyon as well that are older. So might that have something to do with the fine sediment problems with spawning at Norris? Because it's the next spot just below here. So I just wanted to show quickly, these are plots of the fine sediment data. And it's, the green line is Kirby, the red line is Ennis. And I put these in, this is the really tiny stuff, which will suffocate eggs. You don't want a lot of this. So FWP has had targets for the upper river of 10%, no more than 10% really fine sediment. That's what we're trying to flush. And you can see in the upper river, we're staying below that pretty nicely. The lower river, they set a higher target, 15%, because they just didn't think they could make it to 10. And here's Gray Cliff, and it gets higher, it gets above 20%. And when does it do it? In 2012, which is when we had a big fire. If those are cause and effect, I don't know, but we did seem to see a spike in fines in that window where we had some pretty good burns. And this is Norris. Norris, again, really fine sediment in their cores that it's just a chronic problem down there and a worry, because we talked to Matt Yeager at FWP and he's like, you know, the fish are spawning there, but it's only because there's nowhere better for them to go. It's not excellent spawning habitat. So summary for my stuff. We're seeing a good signature of spawning gravels in this way, in the material moving down river. Boulders, yeah, they provide some good complexity for habitat, but not necessarily a big driver of sediment transport. The islands have been expanding, which is good news, except Norris, they're stripping. I took some of the plots of that out, but Norris has very few islands and they are getting just nibbled at on the edges, you can see from the highway, and they've gotten smaller. We get good gravel inputs from the tribs, but Bear Trap Madison Dam is a big hiccup in sediment transport going down the river. And then this issue at Quake Lake, and when we start talking about long-term ideas of things to do, you know, this has come up. There's this giant terraces of spawning gravel sitting there. Is that something that we can take advantage of in the future if we start seeing limitations, which is stripping gravel? I mean, we do a lot of work below dams. It's an issue on the Bighorn. It's an issue on the Beaverhead. And there's places all over the country where people are bringing in dump trucks and dropping gravel at the toe of dams. We're not there yet, but we just wanted to try and get our arms around where we were. It was actually pretty impressive considering, you know, the earthquake 60 years ago. Still pretty good material in the upper river for spawning so far. So I'm going to hand it to Remy. If anybody, that makes sense. Are we okay? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I don't have as many cool photos as Karin, but I'll try to
try to get through it and hopefully keep you guys interested. So I did a lot of the hydraulic calculations, sediment transport calculations, all the modeling for the river and to see how much energy the river has, how it can move sediment through the system, and then how that all relates back to the flushing flow. So it all started off with, and Karin touched on a lot of this, so I'm sorry if I repeat some things she said, but we started off with a bathymetric survey where we walked cross sections across the riverbed in each of the 4 study reaches, and we tried to take cross sections at areas where the channel was relatively uniform and wasn't super complex, just to get a general representation of the riverbed. And so we took a minimum of 5 at each reach, and then we used that survey data to help build our models. And so we did a 1D model, one-dimensional hydraulics of each reach, and I'll get into kind of what that means in a second. And then from the results of those models, we were able to develop these rating curves that showed how the shear stress or the energy that the river's putting on the bed material actually increases as the flow increases. And then obviously those flows, as they increase, they actually relate to historic data. So we looked at all the historic flow data from the USGS gauges on the river and tried to make sense of how often those flows might happen and how often you might expect a certain particle size to actually move through the system. And then as Karin touched on, the Norris Reach is kind of a different animal with fine sediment and a little bit different size sediment than the other reaches. So we went in and did a 2-dimensional hydraulic model of that reach, which is a little bit more detailed. So these 2 types of models, the 1D model, as I go through, I'm going to be talking about the results, and it might sound like I'm talking about them as fact at some point, but a 1D model really is an approximation of the hydraulics. It's representative mainly of the main channel. It doesn't, every cross section that we survey, you get one number for velocity, one number for a water surface elevation. So on the margins of the channel where the water might be going slower, or between the sections where there could be an island, all of that's not actually captured. And then the 2D model, this is a photo of just some 2D model results that I snapped in here, but you can see it's actually showing how the flow weaves around the islands, and it's going to actually calculate velocity in a grid as opposed to just at a line that we cut. So they take longer to build. It takes a lot more survey data, and it's more effort to process the data, but it was valuable on the Norris Reach to provide some extra information for us. And then this one's probably, Karin probably touched on enough, but one of our big tasks was to look at the flushing flow plan and see if that 3,500 CFS max kind of target at the Kirby gauge was moving sediment there, if it was not doing enough, how it kind of related to back into the calcs that I performed. And then we also had these questions raised by some of the monitoring data that was saying, well, we're not necessarily seeing fish populations increase after years with the flushing flow, and we're just not really sure what all it's doing. So it was just kind of a big question, and we wanted to dig into it as much as we could to see how the study related back to that flushing flow. And so this is, I hope you can see that. This is just this is kind of a model overview of Pine Butte Reach. So these little orange lines across the screen are where we cut our cross sections for the model. And then that blue line is just the study reach center. And the reason that the Pine Butte Reach I'm going to focus on here is it's right upstream from where the West Fork pours in and from that gauge at Kirby where the requirement for 3,500 CFS is. And so all the other study reaches are downstream from that. So there's other water being added, and that 3,500 CFS regulation doesn't really mean anything downstream from this reach. So I'll talk about Pine Butte, talk about kind of the shear stress analysis that we did, and then we did everything on the other reaches. We did the same thing on the other reaches as well, but not regarding the flushing flow. So one of the things that we did, and the most valuable thing we did, is developed a shear stress rating curve. And shear stress is the force of the flowing water on the riverbed, essentially. And every particle size in the system, there's a critical shear stress where once the river hits that amount of energy, that particle will begin to move. And we have all these data sets from the pebble counts that Karin was talking about and from the McNeil cores. So we know what the sediment sizes are approximately. So we take those sediment sizes and then relate them back to what the river is showing us. Button there. There we go. So this is a rating curve for Pine Butte, and this is for the active bed material that represents those spawning size gravels. And so that black line flows on the bottom and shear stress is on the left there. And the black line shows that as the flow increases, the shear stress is increasing. And then the horizontal line is the shear stress that it would take to move that average particle size of the spawning gravels. And where the two intersect is the flow that you would need to begin to move those particles. And in Pine Butte, that was 800 CFS approximately. So really low. And then on the contrary, when you look at the coarse bed, it would take a flow of approximately 4,800 CFS to start to move that main channel, big armored material that we see out there that you trip on when you're fishing and stuff. So this was really valuable for us because it showed that we're really close to meeting, or we're over exceeding what it would take to move the spawning gravels through the system, and we're not really close at all to moving that coarse bed material. And so I looked at all the gauge data and brought in all the historic daily flows and tried to approximate how often we'd see these flows to kind of reconfirm that information. And so there's a lot of numbers on the screen, but in red on the right, those three boxes are the days about per year historically that we've seen that 800 CFS-ish flow. And then McNeil core was a little finer there, so it actually took 600 to move the McNeil core based off of the McNeil core data, and then 0 days to move the 4,800 because we've never seen that flow at that gauge. So pretty much it's just confirmed that the system is really bimodal. It's armoring, and that sediment that's finer is moving through the system pretty much all the time. And then, as I was saying, that was the two curves for the Pine Butte reach, and we made those same curves for all of the reaches, and pretty much found the same thing. On the right there, we're seeing for the spawning gravels, pretty much 300 plus, 300, close to every day a year on all of the reaches. We're moving the D50. And then in Norris, this is of the pebble count data. So we're moving it actually 54 4 days per year, which just showed that the energy in the Norris reach and the river's capacity to move gravels and fines was lower because there just wasn't as much energy and the river's wider there. So 54 days a year in a normal system is actually pretty good. It's more than you'd expect if there was no dam. But on the Madison, it was a standout for us. So we wanted to dig into it a little bit more and do that two-dimensional model. And then, as we were saying earlier, the coarse bed doesn't really move. Varney, we actually saw it move a little bit based off of the math, but we looked at where we had cut our cross sections, and Varney was really braided. And to do a 1D model, you have to cut those cross sections, as I said, at these uniform sections. So this number of 42 days per year up there on the right for Varney, moving that big material, that probably only applies to the very main channel thread that when it all comes together, and then all that energy dissipates when it moves into these braided sections. So it's worth remembering that while we're saying a certain amount of days per year, that really is only at that main channel thread and doesn't necessarily account for all the side channels and everything. So in Norris, we did this, I developed this 2D model, and this is just kind of a screenshot of some of the results. And we modeled a bunch of different flows, but we focused in on the 2-year flow event. So that's a flow that would happen approximately every 2 years on average based off of what we've seen historically. And the reason we looked at this flow is because on most river systems, you'd expect spawning gravels to flush through the system about that frequently, just based off of past research and past studies. So we looked at a couple other flows, and I'll talk about that in a sec, but this plot shows a 2-year flow. And the red, orange, and yellow, I'll zoom in on it here in this next slide. But the red, orange, and yellow represent shear stresses that are greater than what's needed to move the spawning gravels at a 2-year flow. And then the green is kind of this range that is right on the threshold of being able to move the spawning gravels. It's stirring them up probably, but not necessarily ripping them down the system. And then the blue is even lower. And then the black dots are actually the surveyed spawning bed locations that we received from FWP from their study. So we overlaid the two to look and say, hey, we know what's going on with all these shear stresses, but how does that relate to where the fish are actually spawning? And as you can see, the fish spawn where the spawning gravels aren't being stripped through the system, which makes complete sense to us because out in those hotter red, orange areas, the energy is so great that it's just flushing all the gravels through the system, and there's nothing left there for the fish to build the spawning bed on. And this was really great information because in the 1D model, we were just showing that the river is flushing all the fines through. So you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be these spawning beds. But then when you look at it in 2 dimensions, you realize that, oh, okay, in these complex areas where there's side channels and islands, even though the 1D model said everything's flushing through, there are these holding areas for the spawning gravels to kind of come out and make a difference for the habitat.
And just out of curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely.
On those black dots, that you got from FWP, do you happen to know which are browns and which are rainbows?
On this plot, I did all of both because we had quite a few years of data sets, and a lot of times they actually share the same spawning beds. So a lot of the data points for brown and rainbows were just right on.
Basically overlap.
Yeah, and actually on this next slide, I'll help.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'll keep talking about that for a second. It was great because when FWP went out there in the field, they actually measured the water depths at the reds. And so what I did is I also modeled the flows for what you would see on average during the spring spawning window for rainbows, and then during the fall spawning window for browns. And I put those flows in the model as a way to validate the results because, it's just a computer representation of the river. And I want to make sure that what it's telling us is actually meaningful. And so I extracted the results for depth at every single point that we had a red for those flows and averaged them. So those 2 red boxes. So in the spring, my model was showing that we had about a foot deep red or water depth over the red, and then 1.1 feet in the fall. And that actually matched pretty much exactly with what their average measurement was. And because those are so close, that kind of reinforces what I was saying earlier, that the two species of fish really do kind of use the same habitat and reds, at least on that reach in the Madison. So all in all, that, just to kind of summarize what that means and what we kind of took from it, we've got this super mobile active bed that's getting ripped through the system a lot, and the course bed's not really moving. And so what that's doing is it's causing the channel to armor. And the results from the Norris Reach showed how valuable areas of complexity and lower energy are to the system, because they're the few spots where that finer sediment can actually fall out and make a difference for the spawning and give the fish an opportunity to build a red. So, and then on top of that, getting back to that flushing flow protocol, it's not really doing anything to help move gravels or to help stir up the bed. So that was kind of from a sediment standpoint alone, we didn't see much value in the flushing flow, and it was just kind of sitting right between the two different thresholds that we were kind of hoping to evaluate. And then I think Karin talked about most of this stuff, so I'm going to keep skipping over to some management considerations. So after all this analysis, we looked at what does it mean and what future studies or future management moves could be done on the Madison based off of the results of our study. And as Karin was talking about earlier, we know that the Quigley slide area is stabilizing, it's down cutting, and it's going to slowly provide less and less sediment, most likely over time. And so what that really means to us, at least on the upper river, was that the tributaries are really the critical gravel provider, especially with how much energy is in the system. If you have a system where there's gravel's flushing through readily, that means that you need a supply. And that just shows that the tributaries, how valuable they are to the upper river, excuse me, and how important managing connection to, at least during these big runoff events, is. And then again, looking at Hot Springs Creek, future management of fine sediment is really critical. And this is maybe Karin can touch on this a little
Well,
bit too.
the DEQ and Helena listed this as impaired for fine sediment, and they attributed a lot of it. They did talk about fire, but also land use. There's big MSU chunk, there's a lot of ag above, and it actually sources up in the tobacco roots, but, anyway, so they have a restoration plan that they've identified this, and it's something that could be taken on, once you have a DEQ restoration plan, you can access Clean Water Act money. And so anyway, there could be work potentially done through the TMDL process, but this has been recognized as something that they want to work on, which is good.
And it's kind of a tough battle too, because as I showed you in the 2D model, in Norris, you've got these fish that are favoring this lower energy area where the fine sediment's not ripping through or it mobilizes frequently. But that also keeps the stuff that's smaller than the spawning size gravel around as well. And it lets it kind of, at least what we believe, kind of get entrained in those spawning gravels. And there's not enough energy to stir it up to a depth to get rid of those fines. So you're struggling because you could potentially say, well, we want to just increase the flows in Norris to try to flush all that fine sediment out. But you also don't want to risk flushing out all the good spawning material that you have because it's so limited there. So it is kind of a tough balance, and we don't really necessarily have a solution for it. But we also talked about potential future projects as far as making habitat like we saw in that Norris model. And we know that islands and side channels are critical to the system. So one thing that could potentially be done would be to either build islands and build it with a core of gravels that are the size that you potentially want for spawning. So as you build the island and it winnows away, it would be providing some long-term gravel supply. And then on top of that, it's helping kind of build these depositional areas for sediment and habitat and all of that stuff. But building islands can come with some complications. There's floodplain restrictions and permitting. If you build an island in the channel, you're raising the water up. It can cause flood risk. It can be hard to manage. So one thing that might be a better solution would be to build an island by excavating some of the floodplain in the channel margin and building a side channel. And then that kind of in turn creates an island and some additional habitat. So it would probably take some more evaluation of what the best call is, but just from the study that we did regarding sediment, these are just some ideas that we kind of came up with. And then Karin touched on it earlier, and maybe not necessarily as important in the upper river, but on the lower river where there really are no tributaries, there's hardly any good sediment input. Dumping gravel in the river in the size that you'd want for spawning is a real possibility of something that maybe down the road would benefit the system. And then as far as the flushing flow protocol goes, it's tough from our study to say just Nick's trying to hit that 35 CFS limit every year. We don't think from our study that it has any real impact on sediment mobility. It's not gonna move the armored bed material, that big stuff, and we don't need it to move the spawning gravels. But there could be potential other benefits to releasing flows, and like Karin touched on, that could help increase cottonwood development, it could increase vegetations, it could help with water temperature. There are things that we didn't get a chance to look at in this study, so you can't just, it's not just a single answer about the flushing flow protocol, and it would probably need additional studies to kind of really make a sound decision on what to change. So that's all I have for you. Karin, feel free to add anything else, but we'd like to open it up for questions and a discussion, and I'll try my best to answer any questions you have. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. So thanks.
Kind of question, just with your study that you did, and then with the water levels we had this spring, just any, we didn't study it again, but any observations or predictions about what happened out there?
You know, I think that it's tough to say. I mean, I did model flows that we saw the past few weeks. So it's something that they still probably weren't high enough to really do anything with that armored bed. And I mean, I drove through the valley briefly during the higher flows, and it's really interesting because you can see the water's turbid, you can see there's that fine sediment in it, it's cloudy, which is what we would expect. But it didn't get, over the banks, it's not flowing through the floodplain. And I think that's just one thing that Karin said with an underfit river, is that even when you get these awesome flows coming through the system, we're just not seeing it do anything catastrophic. And so I don't really have a straight answer for that, but I mean, I think it's beneficial to the system, but it's not doing as much as you would think on like a normal river with no dams, for instance, or in a different system. You might see an event like we just had do a ton of shifting and erosion and deposition, and you just don't quite see that on the Madison.
Yeah, I just add one thing that was interesting is the FERC license has strings attached to the bill. You can't change the flow more than 20% a day.
Right.
And they had to ramp it fast. They changed it to 15% an hour because they said that it was just so full that they had to let more water out. And so it did have a little bit of a different pattern to it in that it came up fast. But I would expect that a lot of the fine ground, what did we have? I mean, Kirby was at 4,000, almost 4,000 for 5 days, maybe. So, we're getting into that duration mode where there was probably a lot of those, the active layer moving like we thought, but yeah, nothing too crazy, I wouldn't think. But then you had mentioned, the other thing we didn't hit on is ice, the whirl of ice and moving gravels. And if there was a lot of gouging last year, might have been some good rearrangement and things like that, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, you'd expect some finer gravel bars potentially to erode and move around and deposit, but probably nothing really with the real channel form. And then
And the reason that I was really keen on talking about it with other stuff, Tom Parker at GM has been working with John on a riparian restoration plan for shade and habitat and wood and whatnot. And, there has been a lot of work done where if you can time it, and they've nailed this, like on the Truckee River, where you can do a pretty fast rise and then a slow recession and you do it when the cottonwoods are at seed, as long as you drop the stage on the point bars less than an inch a day, a cottonwood taproot can keep up with the water, with the groundwater. And they said out there, you normally get a good cottonwood recruitment year about every 12 years, it would hit that magic condition. And they do it all the time now because they actually know how to manage the timing, the peak, the rate of climb, and the rate of recession. But, I'm not sure that on the Madison, you look at Varney and there seems to be a lot of good young recruitment. It doesn't seem like it's really limiting right now. I don't know what you guys think. You're out there a lot in terms of young cottonwoods developing. Seem to be pretty good diverse age classes out there now, so it might be happening on its own.
And one other thing I forgot to mention too is the flushing flow too. We've been seeing a lot of aquatic vegetation in the lower river and a lot of closures because of warm temperatures and all that stuff. So I mentioned vegetation, but another thing to think about is, could the flushing flow be better conserved for later season releases of water for water temperature? You know, there could be a lot of benefits that you have to weigh, and I mean, it's not an easy decision to make when you're talking about managing such an amazing river system. And do you keep flows high to potentially benefit vegetation, or could it potentially be a better benefit for late season temperature releases? There's just so many things that we didn't get to look at that would be super interesting to investigate further. But that's another thing that I was intending on mentioning that I didn't, but I think that's a real thought as far as how we could better use the flow.
And I'm curious from you guys, I mean, you're seeing a lot of late summer thermal pulsing, right? Yeah, wasn't there 4 last August or something? Does anyone familiar with that?
I don't know the count, but I know it's more than normal.
Yeah,
I
they've
don't
been doing it
remember
more.
how- Yeah, exactly.
63 last year.
Oh, gosh, 63 thermal pulses?
Out of Madison or?
Most,
Oh, out of Mass.
highest record, yeah. First one-
63.
Yeah, second week of June last year.
That's a lot of water.
And the problem, so you just saw them file a variance for their change of flow increase and decrease in stages. It's just approved by FERC. Problem with those pulses is that they were regulated by the 2188 license, and of course the requirement at Kirby that they could be increase of 10%. So in order to
Right.
offset that pulse down Madison, they had to release it Hebgen, but they could only do it so fast and so long of a period of time. So then, of course, a lot more water going downstream as you're ramping up to try to compensate for that increase in Madison. So a lot more water was used to accomplish a simple
Right.
task.
Right.
Where now with their variants, they can actually accomplish that task in a shorter period of time and be more efficient with
Right.
water coming out.
Right. Yeah, I think, John said last week that the flushing flow takes them 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks
Yep.
for the rise in the fall.
Correct.
Yeah.
We have the compliance manager for Northwestern on, and I just unmuted him. He can speak to that.
Oh, great.
Hey everybody, this is Andy Welch. I've been listening in from afar. So yeah, a couple different things. Our FERC license really tries to balance a lot of the different things that we are attempting to protect and maintain in the system that Remy kind of got at. And so the water balancing is very challenging at times. But you are right, Karin, last year, a heavy load of pulsing, the most we've ever seen. It was actually 64 days total that we had pulse calls, consumed about 2.6 feet of Hebgen Reservoir volume. And so, a lot of volume is dedicated to, just maintaining that lower system that's, without it would definitely not support, salmonids that time of year. And frankly, I'm kind of surprised that they are persisting this long with, we're allowed to have the temperatures up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit down there in the summertime, which is already pretty dang high for that type of species. And so, a lot of the management and storage at Hebgen, has different uses, but certain years like last year, a lot of it is, dedicated essentially to maintaining that lower river temperature.
Hey, Andy, this is Karen. I'm wondering, so below Madison Dam, how do you monitor the pulse? I mean, do you basically, you're monitoring it purely through temperature, and so you release enough water until you meet that temperature, that maximum temperature threshold that you want, and that's what defines how much water comes out?
So we have a couple different things that we use down there. The majority of the days, the pulse volume is determined by a thermodynamic model that we run. And so it's specific to that reach of the river below Madison Dam, and the compliance point is technically downstream of Black's Ford a little ways. And so the model takes the starting values of, flow volumes and temperature, and then routes that through the system and essentially gives us a output temperature for the day. If that is above what our threshold is, then it will increase the volume and rerun that model, and it'll do that iteratively until the final temperature is below what our desired threshold is. And so we run that model twice a day. The last one's at 8:00 p.m. with the most accurate forecast info. And that's how we essentially determine the majority of the pulses down there. We also have a manual protocol is what we call it. That's based on experience that's used when we lose specific parameters that drive the model. Say USGS goes down, something like that, then we have something we can fall back on in order to provide those pulses.
Wow, thanks.
Any more questions? Thank you, Karin and Remy. If anyone's interested, we also have some maps up here about it's the Madison migration zones that Karin made with a former Madison City employee a few years back. If you want to take a look, they're pretty interesting. Also, feel free to grab a drink or some snacks.
Yeah, they're based on historic, all the blues, the dark blue is the current channel, the lighter blue is the historic channel since the 50s, the historic footprint. And the orange buffers are based on measured migration rates.